Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digi Talks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, and it also gets uploaded as a YouTube video under the YouTube channel of Zenitsu, while also going up on various different podcasting platforms. Today, I'm with my co-host Teddy and special guest Mark Dai from YouTube, talking about our thoughts on the EX04 meta, as the EX04 meta is officially over, and our thoughts about more in-depth deck design. So I guess with that out of the way, we should probably just start with the boring bit and talk about EX4 and how basically nothing has changed.
Yeah, not much change there, and we can just look at the results for confirmation.
So I know we got the Carta Magica top 16 because we didn't have that information before. I did play in that top 16. I did play in that event, and I did top 16. So my deck list is there. So I'm just gonna move this over here. So as far as the top 16, the interesting decks that made it top 16 outside of everything else being already known is Black War Greymon OTK, and it is going to be Millith Loop. So Millith Loop ended up taking first, second went to Blue Flare, third went to Blue Flare, fourth went to Black War Grey, then fifth went to Beelzemon, sixth Bloomlord, seventh Black War Grey X, 8th, Hunters. 9th, that was me on Red Hybrids. 10th was Black War Grey X. 11th was Beelzemon. 12th was Machinedramon. 13th, Security Control. 14th, War Greymon X. Nice to see that deck top every now and then. Then we have 15th with Red Hybrid and 16th with Bloomlord. So when I said Black War Grey, it was actually Black War Grey OTK. I'm pulling up the deck right here. And this is a very interesting deck that solely focuses on the Digiburst ability of the promo Black War Greymon that we had all the way since like BT4. So it's using Chimeramon to try to make a super stack and then Digivolve into Black War Grey and then just throw it all the way for a whole bunch of attacks. Then it runs cards to boost its security attack. And then consistency tools and enough tools to be able to gain a whole bunch of memory to be able to make your combo plays.
Yeah.
So I think this is a very interesting style of deck. I don't think many decks can exactly copy what this is doing. I was talking earlier with you two during pre-show that I felt like we have a friend who's trying to build a deck. I don't know exactly what he's trying to get out of said deck. And we're trying to help him and guide him the best that we possibly can. And he was basically running Ancient Greymon in a War Grey, a traditional War Greymon deck. And Ancient Greymon, while it is a Greymon, it does work with a lot of these cards. I don't think that's the deck for it. And I was looking at this, and I'm just like, actually, you probably could adapt this for Ancient, and I think that's kind of cool that we have not necessarily a new style of deck, because I've always said this before, OTK decks, as long as they're consistent enough and the OTK is strong enough, OTK decks will always be a thing. That will never go away unless they literally stop printing the word unsuspend and security attack plus. Those are the only two things that basically will take away OTKs. But they
essentially,
but they keep printing them, so we will always have them. So it's cool that this deck was able to get 4th place in the Carta Magica. And then Millith, I said this last time, I played against this deck, and I had no idea what it was doing because I killed it too fast because I was on Red Hybrid to even understand what it was doing. So as far as my basic understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you're just trying to use the Guilmon engine to mill, and then you go up into Lilithmon to be able to gain a whole bunch of memory to replay a Guilmon for Rush and then just go all the way back up again, use another Lilithmon to gain more memory, and then you'll end off in like a Creepymon play where you're just going to swing and then mill the opponent even more. Then the Shine Greymon is just there to stall because the deck isn't trying to attack the opponent, it's literally trying to mill them. And I think this is the best mill deck that we've had. I was watching Tesoro kind of like break down the deck and try to understand it on a basic level, and he's just like, yeah, this is probably a new level of uninteractive, and that kind of like scares me, but it also kind of like excites me that I think purple, like from a deck builder's perspective, just has so much freedom and flexibility compared to all of the other colors that something like this at least is possible.
Yeah, I definitely think the deck, I mean, I love anything Gallimon related. It doesn't really focus on that, but the idea of just saying, I don't need to worry about my opponent's stuff. I just need to see my pieces and just mill, 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 mill. I mean, that's not bad. I mean, why would you not play something that you can almost essentially guarantee? Like, what does your opponent do when you're just sitting there? I'm going to mill myself, and you can't prevent it. And then eventually you get them to a point where you can either guarantee mill the rest of their deck, and most decks don't have a way to play around it to filter or like recycle their stuff. So, I mean, yeah, I think it was a good call. There's literally no counterplay to it. So I agree with Tessero's idea of it being uninteractable. Like, what realistically can you do?
I mean, you could do what I did and just beat its face in.
Yeah, you could kill them
anything.
before they get the chance, but
because that was the deck's big struggle. And if this deck kills Security Control single-handedly, I will gladly accept this level of uninteractivity to see that deck die and burn. I hate that deck so much. And even though I should love that deck, Security Control, with some passive interest because it's so different, I think Security Control is abusing the game's mechanics, and that's part of the reason why I don't like it, is because you have to play the game completely differently when you see it across the table. And as we've mentioned before, and in my previous podcast, the Wolf's Den podcast, before rebranding and shifting it to this, it is a deck about forced errors more than actual skill itself. It's trying to force the opponent into bad plays so you could take advantage of their bad plays more than you making good plays yourself. Because the big, Security Control players will always say, oh, my turns take 2 seconds. Yes, your turns do take 2 seconds because it requires zero train of thought, and you have very limited amount of play lines you actually can make because you're not really playing the game. You're just waiting for the opponent to screw up and basically capitalize on that. And then everyone hates the deck because it takes too long, because it's forcing the opponent to think differently, and that's the part that's taking too long. Yes, Security Control's plays are short, but that doesn't change the fact that it forces the opponent to think more critically and differently to the entire game as a whole versus every other deck in the entire game. So that's why Security Control games take so long, is because you have to adapt to it, and that adaptation takes time.
And you could say that we're being just lame, or we don't we don't like it, so we're just being babies. But I mean, that's, I don't know about you, but that's not fun. Who wants to sit there and have to basically play solitaire while your opponent, when they use their turn, they just delete whatever you play and then heal themselves over and over and over and over and over again? I don't know. I mean, to some people it's fun, clearly, because they play it, and good on you if you do. I guess I'm happy for you. I don't know, but I don't know. I just don't see how that's interactive. How is that fun for someone to sit there and essentially do nothing? But it doesn't really matter what I think. It's just an opinion, which you are more than welcome to tell me I'm wrong wherever you want. That's fine. I don't really care. But I just don't like the idea of that mentality of where essentially you're playing for time. That's really more so what the deck does. You're not really playing to win. You're just playing not to lose, and
Yes.
that's boring.
And that's partially why games take extra long, is because you are purposely prolonging the game. It's just like, yes, your turns take 2 seconds, but when you have 50 turns, no wonder why things are taking so long, is because not only do you have to accommodate for the amount of turns that you're adding to the game by purposely stalling, but you also have to add into the fact that you're forcing the opponent to think extra critically where they normally wouldn't. So like that it I hate security control players when they say that type of stuff, because they don't acknowledge what they are purposefully doing to extend the game's length. It doesn't have to be a 50-minute or a 30-minute slog fest. And if you're lucky and you could out aggro them and their security is bad, you could obviously shorten that time. But like, the deck is designed to stall, and it's designed to basically almost be a bad mill deck where it's just forcing the opponent to basically deck themselves because of how much natural draw is in Digimon. But security control aside, we do have some other EX04 regional data to take a look at. We have the Play TCG Texas Regional that happened.
Sure.
That was another pretty big North American event. We see, again, all of the same decks that we literally just saw. I do appreciate Eggman for rebranding Black War Greymon and War Greymon into Greymon Tribal, and then literally have, like, in parentheses or asterisks or whatever, what the deck actually is. So that way it's just easier to, just label it, because Black War Greymon and War Greymon are basically almost the exact same deck. The only difference is the level 5s, arguably, and the level 6s. Outside of that, it is exactly the same. So
we have another Black or Gray OTK.
Yes.
So that's nice to see.
So as far as the top 16 breakdown for the Play TCG, we have first place was a Blue Flare. Kind of nice to see Blue Flare do well, but Blue Flare was positioned to do well because of the new tools that it got in EX04. So that put a lot of attention and a lot of play on the deck, which I definitely like. Then we have Machine Dramon came in second. Third, we had Black War Greymon. Fourth, we have Black War Greymon, more specifically Black War Greymon X. Fifth, we have a return of Millith Loop. Then sixth, we have another Black War Greymon X. Seventh, we have Hunters. Eighth, we have Machine Dramon. Ninth, Blue Flare. 10th, Black War Greymon X. 11th, Black War Greymon X. 12th, War Greymon X. 13th, Beelzemon X. 14th, Black War Greymon X. 15th, Red Hybrids. And 16th, War Greymon OTK. So again, nothing has changed outside of still the inclusion of Millith and the Black War Greymon OTK deck.
That sounds about right. Yeah, I mean, we kind of assumed. I mean, I guess this is also a bit different in this case because there's a lot more Black War Grey representation.
There is.
In this top 16, at least.
I think that is because he deals with tamer-based decks the best, and a lot of the better decks, as we can see, are tamer-based decks. You have Hunters, you have Blue Flares, you have Hybrids, like, basically between Cross and Hybrids, that makes up a decent chunk of the meta, on top of a lot of decks needing their tamers for utility, so denying them that utility denies them a lot of potential and possibilities. So I think, like, it just is normal for Black War Greymon to be, like, up and coming and this prominent based on the direction of where this meta is, being super tamer heavy and tamer centric.
Yeah, I think I hard agree there. It is we're in a weird state of the game currently, at least at that moment. And people were just trying to find the next thing to beat whatever was going to be either Blue Flare or Hunters and that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
so
especially
I see the logic.
Yeah, especially since Black War Greymon is still very hard to interact with for the vast majority of decks because of the sheer amounts of protection that he has. It only just makes sense to for him to want to be played and him being the top dog in this type of environment. But if you want to like talk about some more weirder things, we did have some smaller data from France and from Australia. Uh, is Brisbane in Australia? I know
Yeah,
TAC
it's
is
Australia.
okay, so I'm not wrong there. I'm really bad at geography, so I do apologize for that. But looking at the TAC data, this was only up to top 8 and not top 16, so there was a little bit of muddied water on top of the fact that the TAC did not have a listed deck for sixth place. So, not exactly the best data, especially since it's a smaller event with only 53 players. But we see, as far as what actually was able to break into the meta, a Alter S deck was actually able to do well. So, kudos on that player for making that deck work. I think because it was a smaller event, that's kind of attributing to why that deck did well. And then you could kind of say that All Force broke into the meta, but I think All Force was already meta in BT12, so it would only make sense that whatever was good in BT12 is still good in BT or EX4. So
Oh yeah, I think I mean that what's his that Alter S deck just I think he just got very lucky that day. He just had a good day, good draws.
yeah, the only
Yeah.
weird thing that I noticed was the Agumon from the starter, like the very first black starter
Mhm.
deck. That's the
Yep.
only odd thing that I see about this deck. I think like a lot of people would just inherently want to use the red black Agumon just because it searches for not only just your Greymons but your Tai as well, which you're running a Tai Tamer in the deck and the inheritable DP boosts, so it's still doing something. So that's the only like weird thing that I saw with this list. Everything else kind of just seemed to make sense. Analog Youth was the only other off card, I would say. And that's just another consistency tool. That's about it. While
Yeah.
refreshing your raising area potentially.
Yeah, it wasn't anything crazy. I mean,
No, the deck builds itself.
yeah, exactly. I mean, there's only so much that it could really do, so I get it. I
Yeah.
get it.
And then we had top 8 for France. And the interesting thing about France, again, it was another small event. They have this nice little pie chart that does some kind of a breakdown. I don't know exactly how accurate it is with the win percent because, like, some of these decks that made into top 16 have like low win percent, and I didn't understand that. So I was, or like a deck would have a high win percent and wasn't in top 8. So I'm not even going to attempt to understand. It's cool that they listed how many people were on what deck so we could actually see a meta spread for this event and
Yeah,
like where,
specific numbers rather
yeah,
than
and where the attention was on. So obviously going over the decks that were able to break into top 8, the two big outliers compared to BT 12 is Mastemon and Imperial.
Mhm.
I think those decks are very under the radar. Their lists didn't really seem like it was doing anything extra super spicy. The Imperial player is utilizing a little bit more jamming based synergy, and then they're using the new Pyldramon for some stun and defensive potential. Outside of that, I can't really say I'm surprised by anything here. Um,
Nah, it all looks fairly non-unique, which I mean isn't necessarily a bad thing if it works. It
Yeah, and
works,
then
but
Mastimon was using Creepymon, probably for just another level 5 revive. And then it was also utilizing Shine Greymon Ruin mode, which
mhm.
is a very strong card.
Still using
Makes
a
sense.
lot of purple memory boost. Maxed out on that.
Yeah, so
Interesting.
but and it was using the Itmon for some level 3 revive. Like this was just a more revive heavy Mastimon, and it's cool to see that it worked. So
Yeah, I'm down.
As a
it's
good
nice
example earlier.
yeah, it's nice to see that people are still experimenting with these decks and are still finding success with these decks, because I think a lot of people like this also, Japan is super guilty of this. New hotness comes out, and then everyone plays the new hotness, and then that's going to shift the meta, because they could have been on a completely different deck if it wasn't for the new hotness. So I flip-flop decks quite often, so I'm not like super hardcore locked down into one deck, but I do go back and I do explore other decks to see what their possibilities are. Even though I'm not going to be playing them in tournaments, I still don't think certain decks should just be given up on. And even though, yes, this is a smaller event that could attribute to some of these deck successes, but they still had success. So that accounts for at least something.
Gotta give credit where credit's due.
Yes. But as far as my overall thoughts on EX4, I think just the mentality behind EX4, even though deck strength wise, it really isn't doing anything different than BT12. I think the mentality that we had behind it was healthier. So I ended up liking this format more than BT12, because it, like, people were just kind of experimenting. They were just kind of messing around. We already knew what was good, and well, what was good still works, and people started experimenting, and well, their experiments worked too. So
Yeah, I mean, I dig this. I dig this Mastermind list a lot. I also like the Gaiomon list that's there. It's pretty dope.
Yeah, I was gonna say that the Gaiomon is pretty nice to see up there.
I mean,
You don't see Gaiomon a lot.
it's just more like Greymon tribal insert level 6 top end here.
Correct.
But like that's just the nature of that deck. And speaking of decks, that kind of transition us into like the big topic about deck design. So I kind of already prefaced this with both of you in terms of like trying to explain my weird and crazy thoughts on how my brain works, on like just the sheer thought process that I tried to put into when it comes to explaining and describing decks to people. Because obviously, I have a YouTube channel. I do a lot of deck building on said YouTube channel. I would think of myself as a fairly competent deck builder. And like, I do like a lot of design. I did come from a design background and breaking things down. And there's some aspects of the game that I think people might not realize and aren't really talking about. So one of the big concepts that I came up with, which kind of alludes into like, oh, color versus archetype, because Digimon has been moving more towards an archetypic or archetypical design. There we go, nailed it, first try. And that doesn't mean that we can't do other things, as we've just seen with some of the other, like some of these experimentations with Black War Gray OTK. I don't necessarily think that's a hardcore archetype based deck. It's utilizing mechanics to support what it's trying to do. And same thing with Millith. It's not an archetype based deck. It's using some archetype based cards, but it's using them in a mechanical way. So I think like color identity and mechanics still exist within Digimon, just we have to actually discover them a little bit more than what we would normally think.
Yeah, I think. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier. People are not willing, or they kind of just don't want to. I mean, I kind of understand that part, but you know, people aren't willing to experiment as much. People want not necessarily what's well. I mean, some people just want whatever's easiest. They get them the easiest win, which once again, completely understandable. It's not like if I'm example like going to tournaments and things like that. I'm gonna probably try to play the deck that's gonna win me the most or has the highest chance to win me the most. So completely understand from that front. But I also like the idea of taking your spin on things and really making a deck your own. That's something that I like a lot. I very much love that. So, and hence what I try to do whenever I'm building decks. I try to have my own reasoning as to why a card is in the deck rather than I just saw a list online, which is once again perfectly fine if you want to do that, and that is your prerogative. It is your money. The way you spend it is exactly however you want to spend it. But there's a certain gratification that comes with just saying I built this deck, I play tested it, and it worked because of the things that I tested, and I tested it into XYZ. Apply your deck into that scenario, and there's something very gratifying about that I don't think you get if you just say, "Oh yeah, I won because I saw this deck did really well. I saw it, said I wanted to build it, took the build from somebody, and I got a good win." I mean, if you get it, that's cool. You still have to be good to win tournaments. You can't just most people just can't pick up a deck and automatically start winning.
Actually,
But
you say that, and that's kind of
depending on
funny.
certain decks,
Yeah, you say that, and it's
Sure.
kind of funny because somebody, I think the person who won, or not won, who topped the Texas Regional saw the OTK list and is just like, thanks for putting out the OTK list. I took it and I did well. But
see,
yes, he
there
has
are
to
some
still
decks
play
that can
well.
apply. You still have to make good decisions. You still have to pull the trigger correctly. Like there are still things that have to be in your control in order for it to go well. So it it's fine, but it requires at least I think you should when you start getting more into the game and stuff, really start getting into building stuff just because it allows you to understand cards better. And
I
I think
mean,
that's something you should do as a player. But I also, once again, purely an opinion, doesn't really matter what I think if you don't want to do so.
I think doing that can generally make, like, if you seem like you're struggling to kind of do well in tournaments, I think that's a good aspect to make you better, because the more you maybe kind of what's the word, playtest, like test different cards into the decks you're trying to play, and utilize different tech cards or just different structures of decks, then that's where you kind of find the hidden gems that might be like, oh, this deck with these cards actually kind of counter a lot of the meta decks that are playing in this format, and that's where you find the hidden gems. But if you're just going off of the list you find at top and then play good in that aspect, yeah, you if you top, you're still doing good, like you said, but you could get better by kind of testing in that sense.
It's like that can only take you so far, is what I'm trying to say.
And I think like part of it is the decks people choose as well. And like certain decks just naturally will perform better than others because of the tech and tools that they're playing with. So one of my other crazy thoughts that my mind spiraled into was the concept of how many cards does your deck need to win the game. So this concept kind of spurred by looking at Royal Knights as an example, where it's just like realistically the rest of the deck actually doesn't matter in terms of what Royal Knights you see. As long as you just have Royal Knights, the only card in that entire deck that actually matters is Omnimon. That is the only card in the deck that matters. So as long as you see Omnimon a total of once, you're good. The deck kind of just does its thing, and you just need to support it with a little bit of card draw and a little bit of control tech just to stop the opponent's floodgates. But realistically, that deck lives or dies by seeing Omnimon. Stack-based
Correct.
decks tend to have a harder time, at least in my perspective, because of the attention to detail in the stack. So most of the time you want to pair up and make your Digimon as powerful and impactful as you possibly can. Certain combos only work literally with certain stacks, and I think that's part of why stack-based decks haven't been doing super hot, is because the ones that have been, the stack doesn't matter. As long as you see the level 6, the rest of it literally just does not even matter. And I think like that's just a really interesting dynamic to stop and think about is like, oh, Shine Greymon, his entire stack doesn't matter because you have consistency on the level 5s. The level 4s just are whatever. Same thing with the level 3s. They're just whatever. They're there to be consistency tools to try to just make the deck functionable to begin with. And you realistically just need to get up into your Shine Greymon, have a Marcus on your field, and then a Burst Mode in your hand. So I can't say the same type of thing with Mirage, where Mirage, you do kind of need to pay attention to detail to that stack because you need it to be in a particular state, utilizing every single Digimon of all of your different levels for various abilities.
I was like, you could easily lose because you didn't put something in the right order, or you didn't see the piece when you needed it in Mirage and things like that. Whereas like your, for example, your Greymon stuff, or I think actually a little less like, let's say like Beelzemon, where it's almost an inevitability. You just need to get there. Like,
And that's why he did so good, is because he doesn't need a lot of actual pieces, and it doesn't matter how you build it. You just need to see it, and because you're milling everything, you'll see it.
It's like you'll inevitably get to your win condition just because you play. As long as you are playing, you will get there. Whereas some decks will not get there. I know this, for example, because I played, I was at a local yesterday. I played Alphamon. And that deck is super piece reliant. I went what? I went 2-2. It was 4 rounds. No, it was only 3 rounds. It was a short because we had a random undefeated. But I went 2-1, and my wins were not even because I played good. It was more so I just saw the piece. Like my first game I lost was to the winner of the tournament, Blue Flare player, where I just didn't see a line. And then the one game I did beat him, I saw the line and he couldn't do anything about it once I got into Alphamon or Yukin. And then every game I won, there was almost essentially nothing my opponent did. It didn't matter what my opponent did. It didn't matter what they set up, because I was going to either bypass it or break the board apart one way or another. So it was really weird, because the games I lost hard. Like there was no like, it didn't matter how good I played or what I did to play out of it. I searched. There was like 3 games yesterday that I played that I had multiple cool boys, played, searched me pieces, and never saw the pieces I needed to even get close to winning. So it's like decks like that where their ceiling is so massive, but you still need to get to that ceiling. Whereas there are decks that can just bypass the ceiling altogether and still do that same level of power, but from the get-go, like the cross decks and things like that. So it's an interesting dynamic that this game has.
And like we've already mentioned this before in one of our other episodes talking about decks, it's like consistency is a big portion of it, and the speed on how consistent you make your deck is also a big portion of it. That's why you see decks like Sukamon come out and then they just literally are there, they are a deck, and then they don't do anything because they're garbage and bad, because 1, their win con isn't good enough, and 2, they don't have competitive pieces that a lot of other decks have. Like, I could almost start writing a checkbox in terms of like, your deck needs to do this in order to even think about being competitive. The big 2 that I would immediately put on that list is A, do you have a rookie searcher? And B, do you have a card to play your tamer for free? Like, those are 2 huge things that almost every competitive deck has, and if they don't, they just don't care. Like Beelzemon, it doesn't have a way to play Iron Mako for free, but it doesn't care taking that time to set it up because it costs 3. At least the good one costs 3. And
Yeah,
same
exactly.
thing with like red hybrids. It's like, even as like a red hybrid player, who's very adamant on the deck. That deck is insanely consistent because of all of the different searching tools that it has, on top of the ability to still potentially free play your tamers. Yes, most of the time I did end up setting them up, but again, because I'm not evolving, I'm taking that same level of time setting that up as I would be evolving. And like, again, I don't need as many pieces, and the pieces that I do need don't necessarily matter how I see them, as long as I'm just doing, like, I'm playing cards. The deck, it doesn't really play itself, but it does a lot of work in of itself to make your plays easier because you're not super stack dependent. And I'm not saying like this as a nod to like, oh, stack decks aren't good, because obviously Shine Greymon is positioned right now for BT 13 to be one of the best ones, and that's because its stack doesn't matter because of how the deck is built and set up.
So it's such an interesting idea. Really a weird topic or interesting topic, I should say, because this is a pretty deep topic, because this just goes solely into like the idea of deck building and how it should function, and what decks can do what with their pieces. Like there are some decks that, for example, there are decks that can use their pieces more efficiently than others. Like you could run some of the Greymon stuff in other red decks, like in Jesmon, and theoretically, like the security plus Greymon and stuff like that. But then that hurts consistency in terms of searching and things like that. So it's like you could theoretically do whatever you want with any deck, but how realistic is it to do that? And does it actually help? As we were talking about a little earlier, like how does it really help your deck to do these things?
Or I feel like Machine German is a good example of it kind of hitting both ways, where it doesn't care. It only relies on pretty much its level 6s, and its main play is with the level 6s, but it's also reliant on its level 5s to do more plays with the level 6s. But also, that's why it's not, topping a lot. You'll see one or two, and that's because of consistency, because it doesn't have really good consistency. So it's kind of a good deck as far as like it kind of hits both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, because you also have like flexibility and how to play your cards also is another huge factor. Like I probably should do a deeper dive into like the different types of decks, but like one of the other ideas is there are specifically different styles of deck that you can play. There's stack-based decks where you want to go from your egg to your level 6. There is tamer-based decks where you just want to play a whole bunch of tamers and do various different things, whether that's hybrids or cross or hunters. It all varies depending on, what archetype of that you're leaning into. And then you also have, I think I labeled it in my video, like just your weird, wacky, free zone extra style decks, where it's just like, it's not necessarily following the normal conventions of the game, and it's doing its own unique little thing. And I think like identifying what that deck is and identifying the types of pieces on how you could play your cards is really important when it comes to deck building, so that way you know what you should be and shouldn't be doing based on your deck style, your win con, how you're getting to your win con, and trying to support it. Like, there's a lot of questions just from A, picking a deck, and B, building a deck that you should be asking when approaching, deck building. And there's just a lot of, like, I want to say intricate nuance, but that's only if you're trying to be like super creative about it, and not necessarily all the time creativity works out, but that's what playtesting is for. Like, Mark, explain how you kind of tried to be creative with your Machine Dramon using the jury package. because you obviously have more experience on that than I do.
The idea with that when I came up with ideas, because I was looking at a lot of deck profiles and I saw that a lot of people, if they weren't running Tankdramon for the proc off the Hagurumon and Guardramon, they were running Numemon because it's also another cheap. It's a cheap level 4 to play for 3. And so when I saw that, I thought of the idea of the Garamon that came out that is also 3 to play, but on play you trash a Numemon or a Nanimon, which are the 2 other cards you would run with that package to draw 2. So you could mill something to draw 2 while also playing a cheap body that you could easily go into a level 5 for cheap most of the time on the same turn, and just utilize off of getting into your level 6 just as quick while still having the backup of building a stack in the back for cheap as well.
And through your experimentation, what actually did you settle on in your Machine German list? Did you cut that package, and what did you feel if you did cut that package?
I did cut that package because as I playtested a lot, I was seeing that I would play most of the time. I would always have no more than 3 memory, sometimes 4, but I would never have enough to play that level 3, then go into my level 5 and my level 6 in the same turn. So usually I would go into my level 5 and then that would be passing turn. So a lot of times when my opponent would see that, they would, if they had the way to do it, they would go and delete that stack. So that's a stack I just wasted, and I would have to restart over. So after seeing that happen a lot of times, I figured it's best to just go back to the traditional focus hard on building a stack in the back. So that way, because the protection that, building in the back, they can't delete that stack was so important, because at the end of the day with that deck, you just want to get into that level 6, that Chaos Dramon and then Chaos X to get all the cool effects that come with it.
And it's cool that we had this flexibility to be able to like tech that in, because I was looking at Machine Dramon decks as well, and it seemed like a lot of people were doing a lot of different things with their level 3s and their level 4s. So there wasn't like this super like hard locked, like you have to run this type of a card in order to make the deck work. It still seems like there is some flexibility, but I think like just the utilization on the tools throughout the formats has been more optimized based on how we're currently approaching like the physical act of playing the game and where the meta is.
Yeah, and I mean that's a good thing, because if you look at the let me see here, the top 16 deck for the Play TCG's July regionals, the 8th place Machine Dramon, he runs the Ragnarlord, the Ludamon level 3, and the Tapirmon that gives 1k DP to 2 colors. Those are 2 cards that have been brought up to tech into that deck, but you rarely see decks tech that in. So it just goes to show that the level 3s and the level 4s that you might tech in don't necessarily matter as to the win rate of that deck. So you can tech in really anything you feel that's going to best suit that deck for the meta that's out at that time.
And I think what you said about the jury package, where you're leaving bodies vulnerable on the field, I think that was the big, like, contributing downfall to you ending up dropping that package. Not necessarily because it's not cyborgs or machines. Obviously, like, it's nice if they are, but not required if they're not. It's just the fact that how we were approaching the game and the type of cards you were playing up against just dealt with that problem you were trying to present too easily, too efficiently, and it seemed like it was a good idea at first, because like, yeah, the cheap body that I'm hard playing that's drawing me cards as well, that seems pretty good. But if they remove it and then you're just wasting your investment, then yeah, it just sometimes doesn't seem worth it.
the other two minor downfalls to that was also, by playing that Jeremiah, you're getting rid of another level 4. So most decks already only run 7 to at most 9 level 4s. So to play Jeremiah, you already get rid of 2. That's 2 gone. And the likelihood of you seeing that is less and less and less. So that gives you less opportunity to build the stack in the back. So and the caveat to that package was to just be as like a backup to where if you don't see any level 3s, you have a way to get into your stack. But like you said, if that stack can be deleted before you even get there, then the package kind of ruins the deck as a whole.
And I think like Machine Dramon is also just another really good example on like some of these topics that we've been kind of talking about, because like once you get into Chaos and then Chaos X, the rest of it actually just does not even matter. Whatever level 5s you see is whatever level 5s you see. You're not trying to hardcore plan on seeing them. You do have some consistency with the types of abilities because there's so many different cyborgs, and a lot of them can have similar style of abilities, which goes into how you're building the deck. But whatever you get is whatever you get, and it doesn't make the deck any less strong for not seeing your ideal cards. And like that's kind of just the big takeaway is like your ideal cards. Some people will say they're the staples of the deck, they're the win cons of the deck, and that's partially true, yes, but it's how many things you need to see go right that attributes to a deck's overall success. The more pieces you need to invest, the harder you need to go into forming that perfect stack or just seeing that perfect line of tamers or whatever arbitrary condition it is. Like, the more investment you need to put into it, yes, the highs are going to be really high, but the lows are going to be really low. And then that attributes to the deck's speed and its consistency, as well as just how the deck is even able to function. Like, I was practicing Mirage over the weekend, and there were games where I literally did absolutely nothing but try to draw cards just because I needed to see my ideal stack in order to win the game instantaneously. And like, it just it wasn't working. It was not working as well as I would hoped. I needed to see too many different parts and pieces.
Oh, I wish the Mirage player that I played against had that problem, because that was not the case against me.
I mean, that's just.
I got railed in that game. It was not even close.
But I'm pretty sure, as that Mirage player, there were games where he wasn't finding exactly what he needed. Like, I can't tell you how many times I was like, oh, I needed to Digivolve into this one, but I drew the card that I needed. Just because I needed to Digivolve into something. I cannot tell you how many times that's happened. Or like, oh, it was the next card, and like there's excuses after excuses, but like
I was his only win, to be fair.
Yeah,
so maybe that does matter, but
I think with those kind of situations that come up, like you're saying that when you played Mirage, you were constantly looking for your pieces, but Teddy saying that the opponent he played against that was playing, it kind of saw his pieces all the time, and I think people don't tend to forget sometimes is that this is a game of where luck is a big benefiting factor, and also the way you shuffle your deck is a big benefiting factor. Like if you don't shuffle properly and make sure your deck is randomized, then yeah, you might not see all the pieces because some of your pieces might be still clumped up, and they might be at the it's just those are two big benefiting factors that people don't think about. If you don't shuffle correctly, then yeah, after you play a match and let's say all your tamers are clumped up, you just clumped them up and you didn't shuffle and spread them out, then yeah, when you shuffle your deck, you could possibly just keep them still clumped up in that deck. And you might go that next match without seeing a single tamer because they're all clumped up towards the bottom maybe.
Yeah, but if you like, that's shuffle theory, and that's something completely different than deck design. Obviously, sufficient randomization would play a decent factor into how well your deck is able to succeed, because you are expecting a parameter of RNG that, because you're not shuffle properly, would end up denying you. or inversely could be considered cheating in some aspects because you're not sufficiently randomizing your deck, so everything could still be clumped together, so you would be able to see the cards that you need because they're still all together. But I digress on shuffle theory. Just the idea of like how decks are able to win and function has always been a very fascinating thing, because like certain cards are just strong cards, but like the stronger cards are the ones that we usually end up seeing because they don't need as much work and investment in order to be successful, or because of the way the deck works, you'll eventually get there. And we've seen this time and time again. Like, you could look at all the way back into D Reapers. Like, D Reapers is basically doing almost the exact same thing as what the Royal Knights deck is doing, except Royal Knights is way better in terms of its output, and it's a little bit worse on its card draw, but it's also a little bit better because you're not running too many duds in your deck with the searchers. You're running a adequate amount, and then you just need to get into your Omnimon and nothing else matters. And like that type of sentiment, you could like go deck to deck to deck and stop and think like, okay, how many cards do I need for my deck to, or my big combo to work? The higher the number, the lower that deck's success rate generally has been, at least in my perspective. Because you think of like War Greymon versus Black War Greymon. Why is Black War Greymon doing better? Well, because it needs less pieces it actually needs to see. War Greymon, you have to see very specific pieces in order, otherwise you're going to have a hard time.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that whole concept. And like another thing that I kind of touched on is just when deck building, you just need to ask yourself lots of questions. Like what my win con actually is. Or like even when you're being creative, that's the most important time to ask questions, is so you could identify how your deck is going to win, how you're getting there, what your deck is doing in between the start of the game and your win condition, so your setup. Like there's just a lot to think about, and I make it sound more complicated than it is. Well, that's just what I do. I like to try to overcomplicate things, really get into the nitty-gritty and break things down. Because Digimon, with archetype design, they try to make things as super easy as they possibly can. You just play the cards that are in archetype. This Digivolves on top of Agumon. This Digivolves on top of Greymon. This Digivolves on top of Metal Greymon. Like, they made it super easy to be able to start building decks without even, like, thinking about it. So, like, the Mirage is just another deck. You just need the EX04 Mirage line, the the BT11 Mirage line, and BT13, and then you're done. Similarly, Shine Greymon has that same type of mentality and approach to its deck design. So, like, archetype design does make things easier for you to deck build, and then it's up to you to be creative from there on what types of tools you could use with the cards that are given.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I think deck building per se isn't very complicated in this game. Like you said, everything is done for you, essentially. What comes from the complications is learning what each deck does into each other, and then your tech cards here and there. That'll be your quote-unquote complications when it comes to deck building, and then I guess ratios if you want to be super nitpicky. But like, for the most part, it isn't too hard to just build a deck. Like, if I just look up a Greymon deck, I can already picture about 90% of the pieces. So it's like,
Yeah,
because they just all synergize with Greymon name, so it just makes sense. Why would you go out of your way to play a worse version of the deck when you could just play a good version of the deck, which is the intended lines that they literally designed the cards for?
And I think that's where mechanics come in kind of second, where like if you have a mechanics-based deck, you're usually just playing off of what that color or colors inversely, depending on how you're approaching it and the stuff you're using, is trying to play with. Like, Security Control, as much as I hate it, it is a very smart and intelligently designed deck based on the mechanics of the game. It is sheer, pure, unadulterated mechanical deck. Like, it is interacting with recovery, which is adding threats into your security, and then the removal that is supposedly coming out of your security. Like, it is a very finely crafted deck. Even though I hate to see it, I have to admire just the sheer capability of that. And I think, like, when it comes to mechanics, there are certain colors that have more mechanics to be able to have more freedom and flexibility than others. I think purple, if you're like a deck builder, purple is like your favorite color ever because it's interacting with a whole bunch of different mechanics that generally have a lot of crossover. So making use of that crossover space is insanely important to how a purple deck is going to end up being built and the tools that you're going to be incorporating. So, like, just as a quick example, purple, there's 3 main ways to fill up your trash. You're either going to draw and discard, you're going to mill yourself, or you're going to be taking what you have on the field and sacrificing it to put it into there. So there's just a lot of good crossover where you could have, like, oh, this card on sacrifice draws and discards. That's 2 mechanics that one card is interacting with. So now you have 2 possible routes to take how to use that card. And I think, like, that the cards that have more mechanics built in and more crossover appeal are the ones that we generally see, well, the most of, because obviously they're good for a reason, interacting with a whole bunch of different mechanics.
Oh, duh. I mean, that'll be just how the game will be forever, until they change design philosophy, which I doubt they will.
I don't think they will, because right now Bandai's other card games, like the excluding Battle Spirits, because I don't have enough knowledge in Battle Spirits, One Piece and Dragon Ball, they both, deck design wise, are very similar to Yu-Gi-Oh! Which, when I say Yu-Gi-Oh!, immediately you'll think of, oh, Yu-Gi-Oh! It's an archetype based game. And I'll say, yes, you are correct. It is an archetype based game to an extent, because you have your little archetype core, and then you have just a bunch of staples to center around that core that are just generically good enough to go into virtually anything. Digimon doesn't have a whole lot of those. We do have some, just not an entire sub package to where you don't need to run much fluff. Whereas in Dragon Ball and One Piece, you're just running like, oh, I'm playing, let's just say, a Goku deck from Dragon Ball. I'm going to use probably about 15 of these Goku cards, because that's what plays with the leader specifically. And then the rest of the deck is just going to be a whole bunch of generic staples, because why not? I could. Digimon's design doesn't necessarily allow for a whole lot of that.
Yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh does the same thing where, I mean, they have literal pile decks in Yu-Gi-Oh, like, where there's really no individual archetype. It's just an amalgamation of things that synergize together. So it's like,
well, they'll also like label their decks by like the different archetypes, where it's just like, yeah, I'm Light Sworn, Evil Swarm, or whatever. Like, I'm just, I don't know a whole lot of Yu-Gi-Oh. I'm just throwing names out.
Like branded Eldritch. There's a whole bunch of other things that I can think of, but like, we get what you mean. Where like, there's really no like, there's no singular. Well, I mean, there are of course individual archetypes, but like a lot of times I don't know if they intentionally do it, but like they might unintentionally make things that synergize really well together, even though they're technically not of the same archetype.
I'll tell you, it's an accident right now.
Well, yeah. I mean, if we look at their ban list getting updated all the time, that tells us.
Yeah, they make design mistake after design mistake all the time.
So that gives us a good indication that probably it's not it was not intended to be that way. But digress, doesn't really matter in the context of what we're talking about. Digimon doesn't follow that philosophy, and it kind of can't, because of the way that they've structured archetypes where if I'm playing a Gamamon deck, I almost can't bleed into another deck because of just how important like pieces are in that deck. Like the deck does not function without Kano Weissmon. I cannot supplement Kano Weissmon for another level 5, just because the deck will not function. I'm sure there are ways to make like it's like, oh, you could use Chimeramon, but then that works, but it's not good. Like, why would I lose the power of Kano Weissmon over just using it? Technically, I could use Kano Weissmon, and it or not Kano Weissmon, Chimeramon, and it does work, but I lose out on the massive synergistic bonuses that Kano Weissmon provides. So it's one of those things where unless deck philosophy changes, which I doubt it will kind of always be shoehorned into archetypes, which isn't necessarily a problem per se. It really isn't a bad thing to have just archetypes and then kind of build out and branch those archetypes into maybe sub archetypes, like for example Galamon into Chaos Galamon, and they kind of have some bleed in back and forth. Like you have things like that, which is good. That gives you flexibility and allows you to have more options than just the Galamon stuff. But if you look at those decks, yes, they have some bleed in, but for the most part, they're focused on their specific portion of the archetype. Galamon focuses on the removal and trashing security and that kind of stuff, and then the Chaos Gallant is more focused on just milling more so than actually attacking and killing your opponent.
And this is where, like, when an archetype, like the same archetype, gets too much support, that's usually when problems start occurring, because you're just playing the best of that archetype, and then you take away their best tool, and then they just regress to their second best tool, which, because they're still heavily supported, that could still end up being a problem. Obviously, I'm talking about Greymon, cough, cough. But
yeah, I mean,
that aside,
the biggest offender.
Yeah, that aside, like, when just going back to red hybrids as just an example, like when I build red hybrids, like the deck literally is so focused on itself that there's only 4 cards of flexibility in that deck. You are going to be running the same 46 cards because that is the whole entire core or engine of the deck, is those 46 cards. I could probably be a little bit more lenient and say it's realistically 44 cards, but still, like, only having 6 cards of flexibility inside of the deck, like, that's insanely small in terms of, like, the amount of different tech that you should reasonably think about running and have space for. Greymon is kind of in a similar way, where you don't have a whole lot of extra space to be playing around with various other cards. You're just mostly running what it's running. And I don't necessarily think that's in particular a huge problem, because when they do like some cross appeal stuff, so it does lead to some interesting levels of creativity. But I also do think they need to spread out mechanically and be able to allow us to support mechanics a little bit more than archetypes, because that's when things get really interesting and a lot of deck builders get more creative freedom from working with a mechanic rather than an archetype. But
yeah, I think like when you're playing certain decks that aren't like top meta decks right now, that are hard architect driven, like a good example, Chessmon. Like Chessmon's not a good deck at all, but its archetype package is very small in comparison to the 50 cards that you get in the deck, so you can utilize throwing mechanics into that deck to help better its entire package as a whole. Whereas some decks don't. They require the full like 45 to 50 cards to run its full package, and you can't really do nothing. You can't really have anything in the deck to help better it.
I mean, that's like, I've said this before, and like that's where interesting things can happen, is when your package isn't necessarily fully complete, or it is complete and you still have room for whatever other cards, like that's when you actually have the freedom to be able to spice things up, run different things, have some room for experimentation. And it's kind of hard to like say exactly how many cards are needed or wanted for that level of freedom, but I think like having too many in quotation marks completed packages where it is just the whole deck built for you pretty much, I don't necessarily think that's the greatest thing, but that's, as a designer, that's like the balance that they have to figure out. And it'll be interesting to see how they actually end up balancing it, because most of the time when they do support something, they'll give it another wave of support, and then the deck starts building itself for you because it's just mainlining and streamlining itself. And some of the lesser supported archetypes, I think, are some of the more fun to build, even though they're not the strongest, just because they're not fully supported, and usually they're just literal set filler half the time. But that's when you could have some really creative freedom to be and have it be whatever you feel like you can build out of it. But yeah, deck design is definitely something really interesting when you're getting into the thick of it. So that is going to be all the time that we have this week. I want to thank everyone again for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please share it with others on social media and repost and retweet and whatever on various different social media platforms, while also leaving a rating, review, a follow, subscribe, depending on the platform that you're listening on. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next episode.